Grant is straight out of Marvel Comics. Alcoholic, son of a tanner, manumitter of slaves, warrior poet in the most literal, uncartoonish sense, scourge of the Klan, and thus the original prosecutor of the War on Terror, and so on. More specifically, he's right out of our concept of the hero. I haven't read enough Joseph Campbell, but I recognize something ancient in the story. The dude's name is Ulysses and U.S. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a big Ulysses S. Grant fan. I hope you will be too at the end of this course. Reading the life story of Ulysses Grant is truly like reading a myth. No one else sunk so low nor rose so high. No one else has battled evil in so many different ways. No one else is being attacked by racists, even though he's been gone for a century and a half. Looking at Grant is seeing greatness personified. This is a photo of Grant during the Civil War on a carte de visit card. Each photograph was the size of a formal visiting card, and such photograph cards were commonly traded among friends and visitors in the 1860s. Grant's cards were highly sought after by visitors and friends, so he had to have a lot of cards made to supply all the people who wanted them. We'll be able to see several that he made during this course. The Ulysses S. Grant Life in Brief. Born in Point Pleasant, Ohio on April 27, 1822. He graduated from West Point in 1843 and became engaged to Julia Dent in 1844. He served with distinction in the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848 and came home to marry Julia in 1848. He was first stationed in California during the gold rush in 1853 and resigned from the military there in 1854. He farmed near St. Louis from 1854 to 1859 and tried real estate from 1859 to 1860. He was a clerk at the St. Louis courthouse in 1860, but that only lasted a month. He moved to Galena in 1860 to clerk in his father's leather goods store. He re-entered the military as a colonel for the 21st Illinois Volunteers on July 14, 1861. He was made Brigadier General in 1861 and Major General in 1863. In 1864, he was made General-in-Chief of all the armies of the United States, which was then a 3-star general, and in 1866, he became a 4-star general. In 1869, he began his 2 terms as President of the United States, where he faced down the Ku Klux Klan, he fought for black voting rights, and pulled the country back together. He retired as president in 1877 and went on a 2.5-year trip around the world. He had a string of bad luck in 1884 by losing his fortune and being diagnosed with throat cancer. Always strong in the face of adversity, he wrote his personal memoirs before he died. They became a critical and popular success and made his wife a fortune. After he left office, he began a 2.5-year world tour. He was greeted by crowds, kings and queens, and other world leaders in Europe and Asia. Upon return to the U.S., huge crowds welcomed him to San Francisco. There were dinners in his honor, along with parades and speeches. Crowds greeted him everywhere he went in this country. Later, after a visit to Mexico to try to arrange an international railroad, he was mobbed by crowds in Texas. During the Republican presidential convention of 1880, he got the top number of votes on the first round for president, but not the majority. Delegates finally had to settle for a compromise candidate. It would have been his 3rd term. When Grant died on July 23, 1885, he was the most famous of all Americans, both at home and abroad. More than 1.5 million people attended his funeral procession in New York City on August 8, 1885. Grant's tomb remained New York City's most popular tourist site until 1929. The dedication of his massive tomb, paid for by individual donors in Manhattan on the 75th anniversary of his birth, April 27th, 1897, drew another million plus. Grant's beautiful memorial sculpture in Washington, D.C. was dedicated on the 100th anniversary of his birth in 1922. At the foot of Capitol Hill, facing down the mall toward the Lincoln Memorial, the equestrian statue is one of the largest pieces of artwork in the world. Work on the memorial was begun in 1902 as the largest ever commissioned by Congress at the time. It was created by sculptor Henry Merwin Schrady and architect Edward Pierce Casey. Sculptor Edmund Amatus assisted Schrady as the monument neared completion in 1921. Schrady spent 20 years of his life working on the memorial and died stressed and overworked 2 weeks before its dedication in 1922. His personal memoirs, published after his death, were a bestseller and earned his widow an equivalent of $13.5 million in today's dollars. So, what happened? According to Ta-Nehisi Coates, the North, buoyed by victory, moved on. The South, mired in the past, did not. Young men growing up below the Mason Dixon line felt keenly their inherited grievances and lingering resentments. The South had no industry, poor educational facilities, and few opportunities for young people. The lost cause of the Confederacy is an American pseudo historical myth that claims the cause of the Confederate States was just and heroic and not centered on slavery. Defense of states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery was the primary cause of secession. Secession was a response to Northern cultural and economic aggression against the superior chivalric Southern way of life, which included slavery. Slavery was good for blacks and whites alike, a symbiosis of races which were inherently unequal by nature. After losing the war and having 4 million freed blacks in their midst, the South took up the pen as their new weapon and began to try to change the hearts and minds of Americans by sappy stories of life in the genteel South, where men were brave and honorable, women were strong and beautiful as well as delicate, and slaves loved their masters and appreciated that they were brought from Africa and put into beneficial servitude. There was no rape, brutal working conditions, whippings, slave torturing businesses, forced separation of families, or displaying of nude men and women at slave markets, unless it was absolutely necessary. It was just unnatural to think that slaves could be equal to whites. The Southern aristocratic chivalric ideal stressed how they embodied courage in the face of heavy odds, as well as horsemanship, manhood, and martial spirit. Confederate generals represented the virtues of Southern nobility and fought bravely and humanely. Northern generals were characterized by brutality and bloodlust. General Sherman was crazy and destroyed property out of meanness. Union General Ulysses S. Grant is often portrayed as a brutal killer. The order and customs of Southern society were in accordance with Christian virtue and God's will. Why was Grant a target of the lost cause? The first thing is that he licked Lee in the Civil War. He and his army enforced Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, freeing 4 million slaves and enrolling blacks in the army. As a four-star general, he enforced freedmen's rights, including voting rights during Reconstruction. As president, he continued to support voting rights, civil rights, and the right of self-determination for former slaves. He requested civil rights enforcement legislation from Congress, which was the Ku Klux Klan Act, and signed it and used it after it was passed. He supported the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which freed the slaves, made black citizens, and gave blacks the right to vote. It wasn't until the 1920s that the Ku Klux Klan became a force again. During Grant's administration, it was chased out of the South. The lost cause groups that rewrote history were the Dunning School at Columbia University, filmmakers and writers with products like Gone with the Wind and The Klansman, Southern ladies organizations, and textbook committees. The Dunning School was named for Columbia University's white supremacist professor William Archibald Dunning, 1857 to 1922. He professed that American values had been trampled by the use of the U.S. Army against individual states' policies of black suppression during Reconstruction. He disparaged the so called radical Republicans who favored civil and voting rights for former slaves. His tenets dominated Reconstruction era history in the textbooks until the 1960s. We were all taught that Reconstruction was a tragic period in American history. Dunning's Olympian authority in Reconstruction history and political science fortified and popularized the Dunning School's white supremacist agendas. His work dominated 20th century academia and continues to linger in the racism of today. Writing in 2005, the influential Reconstruction historian Eric Foner analyzed the Dunning School tenets as follows. He assumed Negro incapacity and portrayed them as children. Dunning thought that Negro participation in government was diabolical, to be remembered, shuddered at, and execrated. He described Negroes as ignorant dupes of unscrupulous whites and blamed the end of slavery for unleashing the primal passion of the savages. Of course, the white men who had been raping black women for 400 years had no primal passions and were not savages. A few quotes from Dunning on blacks. The Negroes who rose to prominence and leadership were very frequently of the type which acquired and practiced the tricks and knavery rather than the useful arts of politics, and the vicious courses of these Negroes strongly confirmed the prejudice of whites. Another one, the Negroes exercised an influence in political affairs out of all relation to their intelligence or their property. Here is Dunning bragging about how whites successfully took all rights away from blacks in the South. The disproportionate political influence of the blacks, a change had been effected, and their power had been so reduced as to correspond much more closely to their general social significance. Okay, and this next quote, Dunning is loving the literacy test, which were designed with open-ended questions where any black answer was wrong and any white answer was right. In practice, the white must be stupid indeed who cannot satisfy the official demand for a reasonable interpretation, while the Negro who can satisfy it must be a miracle of brilliancy. Okay, and this one, he talks about modus vivendi, which is an arrangement that allowed conflicting parties to live together peacefully, which is rather strange when you think of one of the parties were captured and brought over here in chains. That slavery had been the modus vivendi through which social life was possible, and that after its disappearance, its place must be taken by some set of conditions which, if more humane and beneficent in accidents, must in essence express the same fact of racial inequality. Slavery, according to Dunning, is a modus vivendi, which is an arrangement allowing conflicting parties to coexist peacefully. So, this is Dunning discussing the first 3 years of the Grant administration as the 1872 election was nearing. That's the second election. The 3 years of Grant's administration had been disastrous to the president's reputation among reflecting men and had seriously affected his popularity among the masses. His disregard for the conventions of propriety and good taste, which ought to control the occupant of the White House, was no less conspicuous, was even more offensive than that of his predecessor. So, according to Dunning, defending black rights was totally out of good taste and very offensive. However, Grant was reelected by a larger majority than he got in his first term. When the KKK and other armed whites were threatening blacks at the polls, Grant sent troops to enforce the 15th Amendment. This is Dunning's comments about that. The frequently recurring instances of military intervention furnished support to the theory, which the president's adversaries diligently exploited, that Grant was a gloomy despot, openly building up an imperial dominion on the ruins of the Constitution. Here is one of Dunning's students, H.L. mentioned on Negroes. This guy really chugged the Kool-Aid as much as you could. By careful breeding, supervision of environment, and education extending over many generations, it might be possible to make an appreciable improvement in the stock of the American Negro. The educated Negro of the day is a failure, not because he meets insuperable difficulties in life, but because he is a Negro. He is, in brief, a low caste man to the manner born, and he will remain inert and inefficient until 50 generations of him have lived in civilization. And even then, the superior white race will be 50 generations ahead. Now, you notice that you don't hear any proof of any of this. It just appears that this guy is really getting off on being better than someone else. So here's Minchkin on Grant. And if you don't want Negroes to have equal rights, you can't be very happy about the guy who tried to give them equal rights. So he says about Grant, he made costly and egregious blunders, notably at Shiloh and Cold Harbor, two of his battlegrounds. He knew the sting of professional sneers. He quailed before Lee's sardonic eye. Wow, that was maybe when Lee was surrendering to him. His 8 years in the White House were years of tribulation and humiliation. His wife was ill favored, and his only daughter made a bad marriage. His relatives, both biological and in laws, harassed and exploited him. He died almost penniless, protesting that he could no longer trust a soul. He passed out in gusts of intolerable pain. Not much of this is true, but Grant did help the Negroes try to vote. Southern states developed statewide adoption policies for textbooks. That way, they could make sure that the children of the entire state were indoctrinated with the lost cause myth. State textbook committees checked and controlled content and threatened to cancel book contracts that did not include and exclude certain things. Northern publishers began adapting history books to appease Southerners because they wanted to make those big statewide sales. It was much easier just to do what the Southerners wanted and then sell the textbooks to the Northern states too. That is how many Northern students were indoctrinated in the lost cause myth. If you ask people in their 50s and older about Reconstruction, they will most likely tell you that it was a terrible time in American history because those carpetbaggers and scalawags were so mean to the Southern people. Officials even counted the textbook lines to make sure Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee were mentioned as many times as Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was depicted as an alcoholic who didn't care how many men he killed, and Lee was a sainted, genteel man who was beloved by his soldiers and his slaves. Southerners sadly influenced how and what Americans learned about the Civil War and Reconstruction. The white people of the South were especially upset about the way the radical Republicans treated President Johnson. Johnson inherited the presidency from Lincoln. Lincoln had just put him on the ticket to attract votes from Northern Democrats. It turned out to be a terrible mistake. Johnson was an alcoholic who was blitzed out of his mind for his swearing-in ceremony. Then he went from wanting to execute Lee to wanting to give the Confederate States everything they wanted, including the right, as in states' rights, to write laws that would essentially put blacks back into slavery. Defending the Confederacy erased the Southern defeat in the Civil War. They were really good at it. The basic outline followed by the textbooks about his impeachment trial to sit on something like every courthouse. Johnson adopted Lincoln's generous and conciliatory children's organizations, sort of like Boy Scouts, and where the kids memorized a conciliatory plan of the Civil War. But he never would have stuck to it if he had seen honorable how horrific the Southerners were going to treat the freedmen. They taught how especially despicable Johnson's efforts were thwarted by radical Republicans. Sherman were. Radical Republicans were the guys who wanted to give blacks the rights of citizens, wrote an article and the right to Salon magazine. Radical sounds like a terrible lost cause. It was a good poison our history in this case. Ulysses Republicans and Congress were dominated by the old, sinister, hateful, radical Republican Stevens dearly for anybody who wanted to give blacks the right to vote. To Waugh, old, few major figures in American history have been so Johnson was saved from an unfair impeachment by one courageous vote. A big part of the answer can be found in the successful campaign by historians, one person sympathetic who stood to up the Confederacy's poor President Johnson from being led by William A. Dunning of Columbia University. They portrayed Grant wrongly. Let's begin as Grant did in his personal memoirs, and as a president of his who pandered to radical Republicans. Matthew Grant was the first Grant over as Dunning contended. The darkest page in Boston Harbor in the saga May 30th, 1630 on the Mary and John. These distortions and settled at Dorchester, Massachusetts. History textbooks, but with many others, he disliked the close union on television shows in Massachusetts Bay, as well as the growing tendency to establish the government in the hands of a privileged few. Accordingly, in October 1635, he went overland to the Connecticut River with a party that prepared for settlement of Windsor. There he assisted in forming a true democracy. Matthew Grant held many offices in Windsor and has been quoted as saying, "I have been careful to do nothing on one man's desires." This is a home of descendants of Matthew Grant in the Windsor area. It looks like they were very prosperous to be able to put up a house of this size and quality in the late 1600s. The poor people would have used logs rather than sawn lumber. Skipping down to the fifth generation of Grants living in this country, great-grandfather Noah Grant and his brother Solomon fought and died in the French and Indian War. Grant's grandfather, also Noah, fought in the Revolutionary War from Bunker Hill to Yorktown. Due to intermittent furloughs, he also married, fathered 2 children, and was a widower by the end of the war. He moved his family to Pennsylvania, married again, and had 5 children, including Ulysses' father, Jesse Grant. This is a picture of Jesse Root Grant, father of Ulysses S. Grant. This is a map of Grant's family's migration into the interior of the United States. They first landed at Boston, then they moved to Windsor, Connecticut, then to Pennsylvania, a little town near Pittsburgh, and then up to Deerfield, Ohio. The Ohio area at that time was called the Western Reserve. This map shows the migration of Jesse Root Grant from Deerfield, Ohio to Maysville, Kentucky. His mother had died in Ohio, and his father, Noah, had distributed the older kids to neighbors where they were expected to earn their keep. Jesse eventually made his way down to Maysville, Kentucky, where his older half brother Peter owned a tannery. He apprenticed himself to his brother and learned the skill of tanning. Okay, Jesse Grant was born near Philadelphia in 1794 to Captain Noah and Anna Richardson Grant. Anna Richardson was Captain Noah's second wife. He had two children by his first wife who died, and she was the second one who he had five children with. The family moved to Ohio. While she was alive, they did okay, but Captain Noah was, as Grant put it, not thrifty in the way of laying up stores. So when his mother died, things fell totally apart in the family, and Captain Noah distributed the kids to neighbors on the condition that the kids would earn their keep at those neighbors' houses. Jesse was 11 and he was sent to live with Judge Todd and his wife and children. Jesse could never say enough about how well the Todds treated him. They actually sent him to school, his only chance that he ever got to go to school. They bought him some clothes so he wouldn't be embarrassed and sent him to school, which he was forever grateful for. Their son, David, became governor of Ohio later on. After he finished at the Todd's house, they told him that he ought to learn a skill and that they thought tannery was a good thing for him to learn. So he went to Maysville, Kentucky, where his brother, Peter, his older brother, owned a tannery and a couple of other businesses. His brother was a real go-getter. And after the apprenticeship, he lived and worked at a tannery of an abolitionist family where he heard abolition day and night. The family was called Brown, the last name, and they had a son named John. And yes, it was the John Brown of John Brown's Body and the guy that attacked Harper's Ferry. Jesse always thought highly of John Brown. However, his son Ulysses thought that anyone who would try to overthrow slavery with under 20 men was crazy. This is David Todd, governor of Ohio during the Civil War. He would have been a small boy when Ulysses's father, Jesse, came to stay at his house. At that time, his father, George, was in the Ohio legislature and the Ohio Supreme Court. One thing remarkable about Todd was that during the Civil War, he started out as a Democrat, which usually meant sort of pro-slavery, and totally turned it around, became very anti-slavery, and changed his party to Republican. This is a picture of John Brown. Jesse Grant would have lived with him when he was living at his father's house. His father's name was Owen Brown. He was one of a very wealthy leading citizens of Hudson, Ohio, and he also owned a tannery. So Jesse worked at the Brown Tannery during the day, and then all day and night he heard about abolitionism and how bad slavery was. So when he got out of there, he was a very strong abolitionist, something that it took his son a while to get to, but he did get there. This is a picture of the John Brown Tannery, built in 1826. Jesse Grant worked at this tannery for several years. This is where he got indoctrinated into abolitionism. This is the song John Brown's Body, sung about John Brown by Civil War soldiers. They think they took an old tune and put these words to it when they were in camp, and it goes, the first chorus goes, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. After a while, someone came up with some new words and called it the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but John Brown's Body was the first song. Okay, Jesse had two goals in life. One was to be rich, and the other was to marry by 25. To get rich, he planned on owning a tannery, so he was saving his money and almost had enough money to buy it when he got ill and lost all of his money. He was sick for an entire year. So he had to start all over again. But he did. He soon had enough money to buy a tannery again, and then he went looking for a bride. People pointed him in the direction of the Simpson farm. There were a couple of young ladies down there around his age. So he went down, met them, and was soon engaged to Hannah Simpson. After they were married, he spent his honeymoon taking grammar lessons. It was very important for him to get educated to make up for all that he had lost in the way of education. He participated in politics in town, he contributed to the local newspaper, and he joined the debate club. Now, he was a bit of a blowhard. He made a few enemies in a pro-slavery town where he was an adamant abolitionist. Hannah Simpson Grant was born in 1798 to John Simpson and Rebecca Weir near Philadelphia. She also had a grandfather who fought in the Revolutionary War. His son, John, her father, sold the farm and moved the family to Ohio. While they were there, her mother died when Hannah was 3, and her father married a new wife whose name was Sarah and moved the family to Bethel, Ohio. According to family and friends, Sarah was a very kind stepmother and quite a reader. She really enjoyed reading books. Hannah was a very serious young lady, very reserved with a steadfast personality. She was just the type of girl that Jessie was looking for. But it was Mrs. Simpson who, next to Hannah, impressed Jessie the most, because when he would come calling, he had someone to talk about books with, and he loved reading and talking about books. Hannah meant romance to him, but Mrs. Simpson could talk about what he was reading. Hannah had all the characteristics that Jessie was looking for. She was described as handsome but not vain, a good worker, steady, gentle, and patient, immaculately neat, remarkable for good sense, kind to children, serious Christian character, very easy manners, quiet, and not demonstrative. Many people thought that Ulysses inherited a lot of her characteristics. This is a picture of Hannah Simpson Grant when she got older. You have to try to imagine what she might have looked like as a young woman. For some reason back then, it was the in thing for women of her age to wear these little white caps around their head, and they're always described as snowy and delicate. But you'll never see Hannah in a picture without the little white cap covering her hair. This is a picture of the childhood home of Hannah Grant in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. We have no pictures of the place that she was living when Jessie came to court her, but I think this gives you an idea of the family's financial status. They were fairly well off to have a place this big. These are two of the youngest pictures I can find of Hannah and Jessie Grant. They must have been in their 30s or early 40s for these pictures. They are on display at the St. Louis Grant Historic Site. You can see that Hannah still has that snowy white cap on. It must have been popular all during her lifetime, just for women her age, because you don't see any other women wearing something like that. Hannah and her husband helped to found the Georgetown Methodist Church, which began holding services in 1827. She was super religious. She would not argue or boast, never gossip about her neighbors or others, did not play cards, did not dance, was very kind to children, but not demonstrative. She never praised her children. She believed that if you did something great, it was because God gave you the chance to do it, and you should thank God instead of expecting praise. Her neighbors said of her that her steadiness, strength of character had been the stay of her family through her life. She was sort of the opposite of her husband, Jessie. He was loud and boisterous. She was quiet and steady. Now, the religion may have caused a rift between her and Ulysses when he finally started succeeding in life. She believed that you should never put yourself forward. And how do you get to be president without putting yourself forward? Once he was in the White House, she would never go visit him, and he wrote her several letters asking her, begging her to come, but she would not do it. So maybe she was mad at him because he put himself forward, or maybe she was disturbed by all the politics and just couldn't handle all the publicity. But she would not come, and it seemed like the relationship was strained. The early years, from birth until he leaves home for West Point. Ulysses was born on April 27th, 1822, in Point Pleasant, Ohio. He was the first child of Jesse and Hannah. He weighed 10 3/4 pounds. He had reddish brown hair, and his eyes were blue, and the skin was pink and white. His family did not name him right away. They decided to wait for a month, and then they would all get together and have a family naming ceremony. Okay, this is where Point Pleasant was located. It was right on the Ohio River, on the Ohio side of the Ohio River, and it was a good location if you wanted to sell your goods. You were right there by the river, and then there were boats that would go up to Cincinnati. So that was an excellent location for that. There was a river that came through Point Pleasant, or at least a creek, and that was necessary for a tannery as well as the forest around Point Pleasant. So this is where Grant's dad had his first tannery. This is the very tiny house that Grant was born in. It's the town of Point Pleasant, which is an unincorporated town in Ohio. It was about 200 feet from a little creek that Grant's dad probably used for his tannery, and about a tenth of a mile from the Ohio River. So after a month, they took the unnamed baby over to the Simpsons, where a bunch of the relatives were gathered for a naming ceremony. Everybody had their favorite name, and they went around the room and let everyone argue for their favorite name. Now, Jesse Grant's mother-in-law, Sarah, argued for the name Ulysses, and it turns out that Jesse had loaned her a book called The Adventures of Telemachus, the Son of Ulysses. It was a novel by Francis Fenelon that was published back in 1699, but she just loved it, and she loved the character of Ulysses. So they put all the names in a hat and had a drawing. The first name that was drawn was Ulysses. Then they kept drawing, and I don't know what the rules were because they didn't stop at the second name for the middle name. So Jesse stopped the drawing when Hiram was drawn, and it turns out that Hiram was suggested by his father-in-law, Ulysses by his mother-in-law. So he decided that the baby was going to be called Hiram Ulysses Grant, who and that way he could please both his mother-in-law and his father-in-law. Now, people in town, when they got the baby home, it turns out they never called him Hiram. They always call him Ulysses. So people in town would come up and say, "Why did you saddle this kid with a name like this? Nobody else has a name like that." And it's even difficult to say. And on the playground, the kids would call him useless and make up other names. So it was a difficult name to have. As for little Ulysses, when he signed his school papers, he would say he would only call himself Hiram Grant. So you know where he was coming from on that name. So after a year of living at Point Pleasant, Jesse decided to move the family to Georgetown, Ohio. Georgetown was going to be the county seat for Brown County. That means that it would have a courthouse, that people would be coming from all over to do business at the courthouse, and it was going to be a busy, bigger place than Point Pleasant. So he decided that that would be the best place for his tannery. And it also had a stream running through it that he could use, and was surrounded by the right kind of trees. So he moved the family there, and the first thing he did was built the front half of this house. So you can see that he had done quite well in Point Pleasant in order to build a house this big, even if we're just talking about the front of it now. when he got to Georgetown. So he was able to build a house, and I think he paid it off in a year, and he also built a tannery. So this guy is a go-getter. After they had been there a few years, Jesse added this addition on to the back of the house. They ended up having 6 kids altogether, so they needed the space. But when you look at this house, it was probably one of the biggest houses in Georgetown. So Jesse was doing quite well for someone who was an orphan who had to be farmed out to the neighbors when he was a child. Okay, so after Grant became famous, the newspaper reporters would come to town and ask townspeople what was Grant like as a child. So some of the comments they made was that they knew he read books by the age of 6, which back then, before preschool and kindergarten, was probably pretty good for a kid. They hung out with boys 3 to 4 years older than himself, which would indicate that he was maybe mature. He was talkative in a small group, silent in a large one. And this was something that followed him his whole life. You couldn't shut him up in a small group, but in a large one, he was silent and would just listen, and especially with new people. He did not like to hunt. Hunting was one of the main recreational activities for kids his age and men back then, and he hated hunting. He did not like the sight of blood. He did not like to eat anything that walked on 2 legs. So, what walks on 2 legs? Chickens. So, he would not eat any poultry because it walked on 2 legs. And his meat, because he hated the sight of blood, which is maybe strange for someone who had a battle with 20,000 casualties. But anyway, his meat had to be cooked to almost burn. One townsperson remembered testing Ulysses' temperament because he was well known that nothing would disturb his temperament. So, as a baby, if you can imagine this, his dad let someone shoot off a handgun close to his head, and the baby didn't jump, twitch, or start. Ulysses and horses. Ulysses always had an affinity for horses. He was the best horseman in Georgetown, and then when he got to West Point, he was the best horseman there. His mother always said that he had an affinity for horses. One time, one of the neighbors remembers that some people were visiting them, and there were strange horses out in the yard, and Ulysses, who was about 18 months old, was playing among the feet of the horses. And the neighbor came in and said, "Do you know what your son is doing? You better get out there and get him away from those horses." And his mother said, "No worries. Horses seem to understand Ulysses. They'll get along just fine." So at age of 5, he would ride bareback, balance on one leg, and at a gallop through town. Now, I'm a little wondering about the parenting skills of his parents, allowing him to do all this, but people remembered that he would ride around town at a gallop on one leg on top of a horse. Okay, then one year the circus came to town when he was about 5 or 6, and they had a wild horse that was trained to buck people off. So they offered $5 for anyone who could stay on him. And I can't imagine what the lawyers would think about that today. But anyway, they cut the mane and the forelocks so that there was nothing to hang on to. A bunch of the boys in town got bucked off until Ulysses got on, and the horse could not buck him off. So he earned the $5, and people remembered that for years. People thought he had a mysterious ability to communicate to horses. He was able to train them by just being kind to them and get them to do what he wanted them to do. One of the sad things in his life was he liked to go fast, at a gallop on these horses, and so he and his friends who were trying to keep up with him were galloping along, and his friend's horse flipped over and it killed his friend. So that was one of his sad times. That was a neighborhood boy. The, then there was the horse transaction that caused Ulysses, as he said, much heartburning because the in this small town people never let you forget things. So once Grant wanted a horse that from a man who lived, like a few miles down the road, a pony, and so his father gave him some money, and he told Ulysses to go buy the horse, and he said, here's $25, but offer him $20 first, then 22.50, and if he won't take that, 25. So when Ulysses got there, the man asked him how much he'd pay for the horse, and Ulysses told him the story that he was to offer him $20 first, 22.50 second, and if he wouldn't take that, 25. So the man got the $25, and Ulysses um, got to be the object of a lot of ridicule and laughter because the story got around town. Okay, because Grant had such an affinity for horses, he was given all the jobs involving horses in his family when he was in elementary school. And there were a lot of stories that came from this. One time, when he was 6, his dad left the house for a whole day. He had business in a neighboring town. So he was gone all day. Ulysses went out to the barn. He put a harness on a horse that was only trained to saddle, attached it to a wagon, took it out to the country, and loaded it with brush and brought it back into the house, near the house, and unloaded the whole thing. He did this trip after trip after trip. So when his dad got home, he had a pile of brush as big as a cabin. Jesse was amazed at it, and he managed to tell everybody in town about this. One time, Jesse had the contract to build a courthouse for Georgetown. So he hired some men to load logs, both where they were collecting the logs and where they had to deliver the logs. But Ulysses was the one that drove the logs from one place to the other. So he would take the wagon out, the men would load it, and then he would take it into town and they would unload it. But once he got there, and there was nobody there to load the logs, so he figured out, he found a tree that was leaning and had a chain, and he managed to attach the chain to the log and to his horse and work the log up into the bed of the wagon. So people were so amazed when this little kid came back with a load of logs and no one had been there to help him. He became a teamster for his dad at the age of 9. Jesse was always getting some sort of side business, and so he decided he would put the kid to work by letting him haul either people or merchandise around the county. So when Ulysses was 9, that was the first time he went to Cincinnati. He went to, after he had delivered his load, he needed to stay overnight, so he went to a hotel and requested a room. And the people at the hotel didn't quite want to give a room to a 9-year-old, but Ulysses had the money and insisted, so he got to stay in the hotel that night. At age of 12, he was transporting some ladies across a flooded river. They were driving along, there was the river was flooded, and he plunged right in, and the ladies were not real happy about this, so especially when the water came up to their waist. But the horses were swimming, and Ulysses turned around and told them, "Don't speak, I will get you through safe." So they managed to get him through safe, but I don't think they'd want to ride with Ulysses anymore. At 11, his dad allowed him to take an extra wagon load of goods for a family all the way up to Toledo. So he followed them up there, but he was by himself on the way home. When you think about it, maybe he knew his way home, but how many, like dogs would come out and chase his horses, or wild animals, or cows, or bulls would he run into? So it would be a little bit scary to think about your 11-year-old that far away from town from you with a horse that maybe they could or couldn't control. But he did it and got home safely. One time, though, he was taking a Mr. Payne on a ride home, who was a neighbor of theirs, and Ulysses was riding along, and he passed a house of someone he knew, and he remembered that he wanted one of their horses. So he took the wagon in and he traded one of the horses on the wagon for this horse that had never been on a harness. Well, the horse wasn't real happy about it. So he did a runaway twice with Mr. Payne. Both times they ended up on the edge of a cliff before Ulysses could get the wagon stopped. So Mr. Payne had had enough, got out, got a ride from someone else, and Ulysses was stuck there with this horse that he couldn't control. So he finally figured out he would put um, his, his scarf over the horse's eyes, and he managed to limp over to a cousin's house, stay overnight there, and borrowed a horse to get home. He was at that time earning money for breaking and training horses and he would do it in the town square. So farmers would bring in horses that needed training or breaking, and Ulysses would do it, and a big crowd would gather because there wasn't a lot of entertainment back then, and it was fun to watch this little kid uh, gain control over a horse. One time, though, he was a little upset about the farmers because they said that they were hiring him to mail letters and, just ride my horse over to the next town and mail a letter for me over there. Well, and then they would say as he took off, by the way, why don't you train him to pace while you're at it? So it turned out that the letters were fake, and they were just uh, getting him to train their horses to pace for the price of mailing a letter. So he caught on to that and stopped doing that. This is an illustration of Ulysses using Dave, who had never been under a collar before, remember that, to load logs onto a wagon all by himself. He would have Dave drag the logs over to the leaning tree. He had the cart backed up to the leaning tree, and then use a chain to pull them up and then pull them onto the wagon. So, pretty resourceful little kid. There aren't any pictures of Ulysses breaking horses as a 6-year-old, but I found a picture of a young boy on a horse that would have been about his size. So farmers would bring their horses to this kid and have him break them. So you have to think that the whole town thought he was a pretty special little kid. In his personal memoirs, Grant talks about being responsible for all the work involving horses from the time he was 8 years old. The family owned some farmland and they owned forested land. So for the farmland, he had to plow and he also had to help harvest. For the forested land, men would fell the trees and peel the bark, but he was responsible for being the teamster who would get the stuff into town. And also, the horses needed to be cared for. He would have to get up and feed them every morning, water them, brush them, and then muck out the stalls. So he said that for this, I was compensated by the fact that there was never any scolding or punishing by my parents. No objection to rational enjoyments, such as fishing, going to the creek a mile away to swim in summer, taking a horse and visiting my grandparents in the adjoining county, 15 miles off, skating on the ice in the winter, or taking a horse and sleigh when there was snow on the ground. Jesse Grant was a combination of high energy, ambition, bombastic, opinionated. I think he was a loving father and a bragging father. So, a lot of things to put up with or to live with when you're a child. He allowed Ulysses to do tasks that much older kids or adults would normally do. And I think they were sometimes an extremely dangerous task, but maybe back then parents were not as careful as they are today. He would go around town sensing that he had kind of a special kid and calling him my Ulysses and bragging about him. And this caused Ulysses to have, as he called it, much heartburning as kids poked fun at him because of his dad's bragging, and then the name didn't help at all. But one thing Jesse wanted for his children was for them to be educated. He had longed for an education as a child, and he said he would never let his kid miss one term at school. They were always going to go. By the time they were like 6 to 17, they were in school all the time. Now, back then, school was maybe 3 or 4 months a year. I mean, the kid had a lot of time to work at home, but for every opportunity, he sent him to school. Schools were not uh, public. You had to pay for your child to go to school. So you had to think about that before you put him in. Hannah was an interesting parent. She was described by neighbors as very kind, very gentle and caring, quiet and pleasant, but she was not demonstrative. If you expected a hug and kiss from her, you were not going to get it. She would not cry. Grant told a friend once that he had never seen his mother cry. So she believed that you did not express your feelings. She did not think anyone should be praised except God. So I think today it would be very hard to hold back praise when your child does something great. But she managed to. She would never praise them if they did something good. She would tell them that they should be thankful that the Lord allowed them to do that instead. Um, and she thought it was a sin to put yourself forward. So uh, I don't know how she thought other people succeeded in life without putting themselves forward, but it's a little strange that she had this husband who really put himself forward. He was just out there. He wrote articles in the newspaper. He was in the debating club. I think he was mayor at one time. So that must have been a problem for her because she did not believe in it and he did it all the time. One way that Grant made up for her shortcomings as a parent was that there was a neighbor lady next door who was the mother to, she had several sons, and Grant played with them all. So she was the one that would be demonstrative to Grant. And like when he was leaving for West Point, his mother just, shook his hand and said goodbye. He went over to say goodbye to Mrs. Bailey, and she cried and gave him a hug and a kiss on the cheek. And he was just shocked and said, they didn't do that over at my house. Grant started school in Georgetown at the age of 6. His first teacher didn't have enough stamina. This is a quote from Jesse Grant, and I imagine that he didn't have any control of the class. The second teacher was Mr. White, who had staying power, but he did it by bringing in a bundle of switches every day and going through them. Now, years later, when Grant looked back at this, he said, that he forgave Mr. White because Mr. White didn't know any other way, but he thought that the bundle of switches and beating the kids all day long was not a good thing. Okay, the teachers only knew the basics. They were not well educated themselves. So older students got bored because they just weren't being challenged. Grant remembers every year learning that the noun was the name of a thing. He said, after a while, I began to believe it. He heard it so many times. So the students memorized out of their textbooks. That was learning, and then they recited it back to the teachers. One of the fun things that Grant thought was fun was mental math. Everyone else in the class hated it. His hand was always up. So when the teacher said 2 times 10 minus 6 plus 4 divided by 13 or something, Grant's hand would be up first, and the other kids just, it was a drag on their day. One thing he hated was giving a speech. They call it declamation back then. And one time after a speech where he was just miserable, he told a friend that he would never do that again. And he meant it. I mean, when he was a soldier, he didn't have to speak. When he became a general, he would go to activities, events, and everyone expected a speech from the general. And he would just have someone else get up and say, the general does not speak at events, but this is what he wants you to know. So he didn't speak then either. And the one speech he could not get out of in his life was the inaugural address. You can't have someone else do that for you. So he had to give it, and he was very nervous when he did it. The second school that Ulysses went to was the Richardson and Rand's Academy at Maysville. He went there at the age of 14 from 1836 to 1837. It was located in downtown Maysville, and his father was seeking an improved curriculum. He boarded with the wife of his Uncle Peter. If you recall, he had an Uncle Peter who had a tannery in Maysville, and that's where Jesse learned his tanning. But so Peter owned a tannery, a coal mine, and a farm. But unfortunately, he went on a business trip at the age of 52 and the boat sank, drowning him. So his wife was left widowed with 9 children, but the children were older and pitched in, so they were a pretty wealthy family still. According to the advertisements of this Maysville Academy, this school provided Maysville with some of the most accomplished and brilliant teachers ever known in Kentucky. But according to Ulysses, uh, both winters were spent in going over the same old arithmetic, which I knew every word of before, and repeating a noun as the name of the thing, which I'd also heard my Georgetown teachers repeat, and I had come to believe it. Okay, so same old for education in that school district. But the one thing he did hear that he wouldn't hear other places, other schools, were the abolition ideas. His uncle's family were all abolitionists, so we did hear a lot of that. This is a picture of Richardson's and Rand's Maysville Academy that Grant attended for 2 winters in 1836 and 1837. This is the location of the Rankin Academy in Ripley, Ohio. You can see that it is a bit closer to Georgetown. It was only 8 miles away, and it was on the Ohio side of the Ohio River. Rankin Academy was the last school that Grant attended while he was at home. He went there from 1838 to 1839 and finished when he was 17 years old. It was run by John Rankin, who was listed in the Abolitionist Hall of Fame. He was one of the nation's best known Underground Railroad conductors and helped over 2,000 slaves escape. It was told that Harriet Beecher Stowe had visited the family, and from listening to stories that they told about the slaves, she came up with the character Eliza Harris for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, recently, the country had passed a fugitive slave law requiring northern states to return to southern states their escaped property, which was slaves. A lot of northern people were upset about this. Rankin said that disobedience to this enactment, or the fugitive slave law, is obedience to God. Now, Ulysses had his usual statement about schools. My study habits did not justify the tuition at Rankin's Academy. This is a view from the Rankin house window. The house is up on a hill, and they've got a lantern in the window, and they're looking from Ohio across the Ohio River into Kentucky. So they're looking from free land into slave land. Okay, this is a view of the Rankin house up on a hill. It's sitting in Ohio, it's across the Ohio River, and the camera is in Kentucky. So this would have been the view that runaway slaves saw when they were looking for part of the Underground Railroad. They knew it was up on a hill, and they knew there would be a lantern in the window. Deciding on a career. One business that Grant could have got into was the family business, the tannery. Okay, it is considered one of the most odoriferous trades there is. Skins arrive at the tannery dried and stiff and dirty with soil and gore. So, first, tanners need to soak the skins in water to clean and soften them. Then, very labor intensive, they have to pound and scour the skins to remove any remaining flesh and fat. The hair is removed by painting it with an alkaline lime mixture. So after the hair is loosened with that mixture, the tanners have to physically scrape it off with a knife. Then there's a mixture of ground tree bark and water, which is applied to the leather and used to soften the hide or tan it. And then after that, oils are rubbed on it to keep the leather flexible. So this is just one big manual labor machine here that requires lots of people to work it. But Grant was not interested because the smell just really got to him. This shows a couple of tannery employees doing the hard work of scraping off the hides. They may be scraping off, I'm not sure, the excess flesh and fat, or they may be doing the hair, but both sides had to be scraped by hand. This shows another room full of men working in a tannery. They're scraping, they're stirring the bark down there, they're transporting the hides. What you don't see is that the hides weigh about 200 pounds. So it is very difficult to move those hides around. This was a very labor intensive operation. So when Ulysses had the career talk with Dad, he let him know that he hated the tannery. And the father probably already knew that. Whenever he needed more help in the tannery, he would tell Ulysses, yeah, you got to get out there and do it. But instead of doing that, Ulysses would go to town, he would find a job, something to do with horses, then he would hire a kid to take his place. So his father decided at 16, though, that Grant should really start working in the tannery to learn the trade. And Ulysses told him he would do it until he turned 21, but after that, he would never step foot in again because he just hated it. So this gives you an idea of how much control parents seem to have over kids until they turn 21. Then they would have their freedom. So Jesse said that he and Ulysses had this career talk, and he told him, if you don't like it and don't want to continue in it, I don't want you to do it now. What do you think you would like to do? So Ulysses told him that, he really didn't know, but he said maybe a job on a boat. He had seen a lot of boats going up and down the Ohio River, or farming, or perhaps he would like to get an education. Recently, one of the Bailey boys had received an appointment to West Point where he would get that free education, but he had failed at his courses and was kicked out of West Point. Jesse decided he was going to try to get that place for Ulysses. West Point. Going after the West Point appointment and the Thomas Hamer problem. So Congressman Thomas Hamer had the right of appointment. Jesse and Hamer had been great friends until they had a disagreement. According to Ulysses, he couldn't quite remember, but they had a warm discussion which finally became angry over some act of President Jackson. Ulysses thought maybe it was removal of the deposit of public monies, I think, after which they never spoke again until after his appointment. So, trying to avoid Hamer, Jesse tried to do a workaround. He would write Senator Thomas Morris inquiring about the appointment to the military academy for Ulysses. But he was referred to Thomas Hamer because Thomas Hamer had the right to do it. Senators did not. So on February 19th, Jesse wrote a request to Hamer. Both Jesse and Hamer were eager for rapprochement, and Hamer generously gave Ulysses the appointment that Jesse requested. However, he didn't receive the request until right before the session ended, and I believe his term had ended and he wasn't coming back. So he quickly wrote out the appointment for Ulysses S. Grant, not Hiram Ulysses Grant. He had no idea that Ulysses's first name was Hiram, and he was guessing that since they had a son named Simpson, which was named after his mother's maiden name, that Ulysses probably had a middle name of Simpson. So he wrote out Ulysses S. Grant, and that became Ulysses's name. Ulysses wrote about receiving the appointment in his personal memoirs. He was on vacation from Ripley, and his father received a letter from the Honorable Thomas Morris, who was the senator, then United States Senator from Ohio. And Grant says, when he read it to me, He said, Ulysses, I believe you're going to receive the appointment. What appointment? I inquired. To West Point. I have applied for it. But I won't go, I said. He said he thought I would, and I thought so too, if he did. I really had no objection to going to West Point, except that I had a very exalted idea of the requirements necessary to get through. I did not believe I possessed them and could not bear the idea of failing. The second name changed. To prepare to go to West Point, his parents had a trunk made for him in town. As he and his cousin were packing it, they noticed his initials, HUG, had been pounded in with tacks. This caused great consternation to Ulysses, knowing that the boys at West Point would probably call him Hug. They switched the letters to UHG because he was planning to become Ulysses Hiram Grant to get himself from under those initials and the order that they were in. One thing a person should be able to do when they go to college is reinvent themselves, and Ulysses was planning to do just that. It was finally time to say goodbye to his undemonstrative parents. They shook his hand and told him to do well. Then he went next door to say goodbye to Mrs. Bailey and her daughters. He got a hug, he got a kiss on the cheek, and tears. They were all crying. And he looked at them and thought, "You're crying because I'm leaving. That didn't happen at home." And remember, this is a 2-year absence. They did not get a vacation until their second summer at West Point. So Grant was on his way, and he still was so afraid that he would not be able to live up to what was required at West Point. So he hoped for a non fatal but sufficiently. This is a map that shows Grant's route all the way from his home to West Point. First, he had to take a carriage from Georgetown to Ripley, and from Ripley, he caught the steamboat and took it to Pittsburgh. He took a canal boat to Harrisburg with a short train ride to get over the mountains, then a train to Philadelphia. Now, once he got to Philadelphia, there were some friends of Sarah Simpson's there that he went to see and stayed with, and he stayed for 5 days. He got a letter from his father saying, "Why were you dallying so long along the way?" Well, he wanted to see every block of Philadelphia. He was just loving to see new things, and so he totally explored Philadelphia. And then he discovered the plays there and went to the play every night. Saw a lot of great plays. Okay, then after that, took a train to New York, and at the same hotel that he was staying at, he met a young man by the name of Fred Dent. And talking together, they discovered they were both students at West Point, are going to be students, and they took the steamboat to West Point together. When they arrived at West Point, they checked into the West Point Hotel, a private hotel that was near West Point. Grant signed his name Ulysses H. Grant, even though it was really Hiram Ulysses Grant. So he was reinventing himself already. So the next day, he leaves the West Point Hotel, where he's registered as U.H. Grant, and goes to register at West Point. And he's ready with his name change. He's going to have a new name and get rid of those horrible initials, or the order of those horrible initials. So he told them that he was Ulysses Hiram Grant, but they could not find that on file. And he said, "Well, try Hiram Ulysses Grant," but they couldn't find that on file. But there was a Ulysses S. Grant. So he told them, "Oh, just fix it. They made a mistake. My name is really Hiram Grant, Ulysses Hiram Grant." And they said, "Well, we don't have any openings for a Ulysses Hiram Grant. We only have an opening for a U.S. Grant. So either you can go home now or you can take it up with the Secretary of War. Well, this seemed rather daunting, so he decided that his father would be upset if he went home, so he decided to become U.S. Grant. When you think about it, if you were going to become a famous general in a big civil war fighting for the United States, what better name could you have than U.S. Grant? But Grant very reluctantly accepted this and wrote all of his private correspondence, Ulysses Hiram. Now, when he was in the army and a general, one of the congressmen wrote him asking him, "What does the S stand for in your name?" And he said, "I can only say that the S in my name stands for nothing." So many historians call him Ulysses Simpson Grant. Well, they could keep calling him Ulysses Simpson Grant, but he didn't agree. He said it stands for nothing. But we're not done changing his name. Once he got there, when you're at West Point, everybody gets a nickname. So the senior cadets usually gave the freshmen nicknames, and there was one senior cadet there who witnessed it all by the name of William Sherman, who was later on to work so closely with Grant in the Civil War. So he remembered that they were looking at a posting of all the new freshmen, and someone saw U.S. Grant, and someone said, "You mean United States Grant?" And someone else said, "Oh, Uncle Sam Grant." And then someone else said, "Sam Grant." So he became Sam Grant during the next 4 years, and for the rest of his life, West Pointers called him Sam. So when cadets first get to West Point, they don't get rooms. They put tents out on the lawn and they make them sleep on the hard ground, on the dirt, for all summer long. And they drill, they learn how to use guns, they learn how to become soldiers. So in the fall, when they start taking their classes, they get to have rooms, which seem very luxurious at the time. So when Grant finally got his room in September, he decided to write a letter to his cousin. Now, I think it's quite a delightful letter, and I'm going to read you some quotes from it because it shows his personality, what kind of kid he was. And keep in mind, this kid is a little kid. He's only 5 foot 1 inches tall and not very heavy, very skinny little kid. I won't make you try to read this, but I wanted you to see a close up of his writing. He is just so artistic. Look at the way he makes his letters and the curly cues. It is just amazing that anybody could write this way. But maybe everybody did after many years of grammar school back in the 1800s. But it is beautiful handwriting. Now, Grant was an excellent writer. He was one of the best writers in the Army, and he could tell people exactly what he wanted them to do in as short as words as possible. He had the best vocabulary. For his personal memoirs, they are a classically written, and I don't think any other president has written anything as good as his. But that being said, he could not spell. And I think this gives hope to anybody who has a little dyslexia and can't spell, because you can become a general and you can become president if you don't know how to spell. So many times his writings are just left, or the spelling is left the way he did it. So we'll read this first paragraph to his cousin. His cousin was named McKinstry. So I have put aside my algebra and French, and I'm going to tell you a long story about this prettiest of places, West Point. So far as it regards natural attractions, it's decidedly the most beautiful place that I have ever seen. Here are hills and dales, rocks and rivers, all pleasant to look at. From the window near, I can see the Hudson, that far famed, that beautiful river, with its bosom studded with hundreds of snow white sails. Again, if I look another way, I can see Fort Putnam, frowning far above, a stern monument of a sterner age, which seems placed there on purpose to tell us the glorious deeds of our fathers, and to bid us remember their sufferings, to follow their examples. This is a picture of the Hudson River. The painting was done from West Point. So you can see what he's talking about here. There are the white sails, there's the bosom of the river, and it's being studded with the white sails. In short, this is the best of all places, the place of all places for an institution like this. I have not told you half of its attractions. Here is the house Washington used to live in. There, Kosciuszko used to walk and think of his country and of ours. Over the river, we are shown the dwelling house of Arnold, that base and heartless traitor to his country and his God. I do love the place. It seems as though I could live here forever if my friends would only come too. So he's showing a little loneliness for his friends. Now, all this sounds nice, very nice. What a happy fellow you are, you will say. But I am not one to show false colors, the brightest side of the picture. So I will tell you about a few of the drawbacks. First, I slept for 2 months upon one single pair of blankets. Now, this sounds romantic, and you may think it's very easy. But I tell you what, cuz, it is tremendous hard. Suppose you try it by the way of experiment for a night or two. I am pretty sure that you would be perfectly satisfied that it is no easy matter. But glad I am. These things are over. We are now in our quarters. This is a painting of what the summer encampment looks like at West Point. It must have been difficult to have the buildings all around you. See how comfortable it must be in the buildings and be stuck out there in the tents with the 2 blankets that you got to sleep on. But they decided it's best to make the freshmen suffer a bit. I mean to study hard and stay if it be possible. If I cannot, very well, the world is wide. I have now been here about 4 months and have not seen a single familiar face or spoken to a single lady. I wish some of the pretty girls of Bethel were here just so I might look at them. We're hearing a little homesickness. But what I really want you to remember is the first statement, that I want to study hard and stay if possible, but if I cannot, very well, the world is wide. Somehow there was one point in his life where he no longer believed this. He could no longer see this. The world was not wide, and he could not figure it out. Okay. In this next section, he shows that he has a sense of humor and he can point it at himself. He can make fun of himself. So if I were to come home now with my uniform on, the way you would laugh at my appearance would be curious. My pants sit as tight to my skin as the bark to a tree. And if I do not walk military, that is, if I bend over quickly or run, they are very apt to crack with a report as loud as a pistol. My coat must always be buttoned up tight to the chin. It is made up of sheep's gray cloth, all covered with big round buttons. It makes me look very singular. If you were to see me at a distance, the first question you would ask would be, is that a fish or an animal? This is a picture of the 1842 cadet uniform. You can see that it would not be very comfortable to wear, and I believe that Grant just hated wearing it. He often got demerits for not having it on just right. So Grant is having conflicting feelings about the academy. It's tough. He has to wear a uniform all the time. He's got to salute. He's got to do all these military things, and he's got to study really hard. And he can't see his family again for 2 whole years. So it's very difficult for him, and probably was for most boys. So early in the session of the Congress, which met in December 1839, a bill was discussed abolishing the military academy. This is from his personal memoirs. I saw in this an honorable way to obtain a discharge and read the debates with much interest, but with impatience at the delay in taking action, for I was selfish enough to favor the bill. He was so excited that maybe he would get out of this because Congress would get rid of the academy. And back then, people were very wary of a standing military. They saw over in Europe that sometimes the standing military would take over the government. So people were a little fearful of this. So it wasn't West Point was not as popular as it is today. So he ends by saying it never passed, and a year later, although the time hung drearily with me, I would have been sorry to have seen it succeed. From his personal memoirs, much of the time, I'm sorry to say, was devoted to novels. In his senior year, Grant was president of the Literary Society. It was called the Dialectic. They pooled their money to buy novels to share. This was very important to them. They didn't have movies, they didn't have TV, they didn't have music, they just had the novels to read. So they would decide on what novel they wanted to get, then read it and pass it around. You would wonder, why didn't they just go to the library at West Point and get some books? Well, that was because at that time the library was considered mainly for faculty, so they could study and maybe improve their rank. But it was, yeah, West Point cadets were kind of discouraged from using it. He was also in a secret society called TIO, which stood for 12 in 1. So it was some loyalty society. You really didn't talk too much about it, but they had rings made, and they were to give the rings to their future brides, which I think they all did. His only claim to fame at the academy was horsemanship. He was the best equestrian at the academy, which was kind of surprising because a lot of Southerners really put a lot of emphasis on horsemanship, and he bested them all. If there was some horse that was hard to control, they would always take it to Grant, and he could figure out what to do with it. And it didn't include beating or anything like that. He just knew how to let the horse know what he wanted it to do. Now, as far as rank, he remained a private for 4 years. He gained rank once, they advanced him to sergeant, but then he was busted back to private in the end. According to him and his personal memoirs, advanced rank was too much for me. Finally, after 2 years, he gets to go home. So the class received their usual furlough after 2 years, extending from the close of the June examination to the 28th of August. So he had almost 2 months at home. He said, "This I enjoyed beyond any other period of my life." His family had moved to Bethel, which was about 10 miles away from Georgetown, but he spent most of his time in his old hometown of Georgetown. His father had purchased an unbroken horse for him. Everybody knew that he liked to break his own horses for him to use on the vacation. His mother noticed that he had grown much straighter, and he told her that that was the first thing they taught him when he got to West Point. He had brothers and sisters at home. Mary Frances, the youngest one, was 2, so you can see the mother was occupied with these little kids. Orville was 6, Virginia 9, Clara 13, and Simpson was 16. So there was a house full when he got home. He had 12 weeks of vacation, and he said it seemed like 1 week at West Point. It went by so quickly. On his return, he was made sergeant, but soon was busted back to private. And his quote was, "The promotion was too much for me." This shows on a map how far he had to ride back to Georgetown. His family was now living in Bethel, a little bit closer to Cincinnati, and he was about 10 miles from Georgetown. He spent most of his time there, or maybe some of his friends had moved around. Usually they didn't move too far, so he spent all that 12 weeks visiting as much as possible. One of the ways that they had of keeping order at West Point was by giving out demerits. If a student didn't behave himself, if you got too many demerits, you could actually get kicked out of West Point. And it looks like from this article that if you got 200 a year, you would be thrown out. So this article is from someone who signs himself assistant professor of military academy at West Point when General Grant was a cadet. So he said that Grant could have gotten 200 in 1 year, and he had like 59 the first year, 67 the second year, 98 the third year, and 65 the fourth year. So he had 290 in 4 years, which he thought was pretty good. Grant was not a perfect cadet. He wasn't there because he wanted to be there. He was there because his dad wanted him to be there. So he was going to do what it took to get through, but he wasn't going to do what it took to become a perfect student. Now, opposite this is the great General Lee that we all read in our textbooks because the South stuffed it in there. That Lee was the perfect general, and Lee was perfect. It is just amazing. He didn't get one demerit in 4 years at West Point. I think he may have been the only student that ever did that. And you have to think, how weird is that? This is a book that shows that's open to all of his demerits. So you can see they recorded the date and what he did. I can't read it very well, but it's been read by some other people, and they say that his delinquencies or his demerits included things like lateness at roll call, improper care of weapons, disrespecting superior officers, and who know what that meant, not having his shoes tied, sitting down on duty, and maybe slovenly dress. So none of them were very serious, but he did collect a few of them. This is a close-up of Grant's demerit page. About the only thing I can make out on it is that he was not saluting an officer. I think they say when he did it. The other thing up here, balls not proper, something about, that's probably something about a weapon. But they would write down, they were very particular about what they did to deserve their demerit, and they kept that book forever, so you were stuck with it. Okay, the curriculum of West Point fell under the auspices of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. One of the reasons that Congress voted the money for West Point was that it was going to be an engineering school, and the United States was desperate for engineers. We had railroads coming, we have larger buildings coming, bridges, so we needed engineers, and there were no engineering schools in this country. The father of, or the person considered the father of the military academy, was Major Sylvanus Thayer. He had gone to France and learned how these schools are run. And when they first started it, without Thayer, it was a mess. There was no order, there was no discipline. People didn't learn a lot. So when they put him in, he really got the academy into shape. He improved the academic standards, he instilled military discipline, and emphasized honorable conduct and officership, all those things that needed to be done. The Academy was the first engineering school in the United States. The graduates were responsible for most engineering projects in the United States, and also when they were having a battle and they needed some defensive works, that general really needed an engineer to help him set up the best defensive works. One of the things that Grant was known for at West Point was that he was imperturbable. One of the stories his fellow classmates liked to tell was the time they were all standing out in the hall waiting to get into the math classroom. One of the boys had brought this big clock along that one of his relatives had sent. He was passing around so everybody could see it. Well, when the teacher came out, Grant had the clock, and they were not supposed to have anything like this in their hands before class, so he quickly put it inside his uniform coat. So they all went inside, and then at one point in the class, Grant was called on to work a problem up on the board. So while he was working it, all of a sudden the clock went off with a loud bong, 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 and you could not tell where the sound was coming from. The teacher looked everywhere for it. He looked in the back of the classroom, the front of the classroom. He went outside and looked in the hall, and Grant just kept on explaining that problem, never flinched, never jumped, just kept on doing the problem. And so they got away with it that time. Another time, he and his roommate were cooking a turkey in their room, something that was totally illegal. They heard a knock on the door, and when they opened it, it was the supervisor of cadets looking for who was cooking meat in the dorm. So Grant and his roommate together backed over toward the fireplace, side by side with little baby steps. And as the guy was inspecting their room, going back and forth, they used little baby steps to move one direction and the other direction, blocking his sight from the turkey. He finally had inspected enough and left the room. So Grant and his roommate had gotten away with something else. This is the art teacher at West Point. His name was Robert Walter Weir, and he belonged to the Hudson River School of Art. He was there from 1834 to 1876, so he had staying power. He was there before Grant got there, and he lasted until the end of Grant's second term as President of the United States. Art was taught for drawing battle maps and situations in war. So there was a good reason for them to have an art teacher there. Now, he did have a couple of notable art students. One of them was James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who did Whistler's Mother, and Seth Eastman. He also developed a special relationship with another student, Ulysses S. Grant. He offered free time in the afternoon for students to come in and do art a little bit more and do some artistic art, and Grant would often come in for those sessions. To give you an idea of the talent that Grant's art teacher had, we'll show you a few paintings. This is called The Embarkation of the Pilgrims, 1837. This is hung in the Capitol Rotunda of the United States Capitol Rotunda. This is a painting called Entrance to a Wood, 1836, and it hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. This is called the Greenwich Boat Club. He did this in 1833, and today it hangs in the Princeton University Art Museum. Ulysses S. Grant was an art student at West Point, and art was his favorite class. We allowed students to come in the afternoon and work on art, and Ulysses frequently attended. However, only 8 pieces of his artwork survived. In later life, he occasionally did some art, but he always gave it away. This is a picture of a plow horse taking his oats, it looks like, in a bag. And people say that it actually looks kind of sad and overworked the way he drew it. It looks like it has some feelings. This is a drawing of a couple of Native Americans. It looks like the woman may have a baby in her arms. They're talking to a trader, trying to get a good deal. This is a watercolor of a valley with a lake in it. It has some mountains, some shadows. It's pretty good. He sent this to a girl, so this did not belong to the academy or to a museum. A family owned this one. This is a picture of 2 couples who are visiting each other, one from the ground and the other couple is up on a horse. These next few are illustrations that were probably copied because that's how art was taught back then. And you can see that he does have some talent. They are, the last few are beaten up, but they have been carefully preserved. So just take a look at these. This last one was done by James Abbott McNeill Whistler when he was at the Academy. So you can compare his works with Grant's works. Whistler actually flunked out of the Academy, and he thought it came down to one test question on one test. So he said during the Civil War, had silicon been a gas, I would have been a major general. West Point finally started offering horsemanship after they had been around for 40 years. And it just happened to be during Ulysses Grant's second year. It must have been a godsend for Grant because he loved horses so much, and he loved the freedom of taking a horse and just riding around the Academy grounds, and they even let him go beyond Academy grounds. And one of the big pluses for Grant was no uniforms were required. Grant hated the uniforms. Until then, no cadets knew how talented Grant was with horses. And now that they had horses, they could see just what he could do. So if cadets had fractious horses that were hard for them to tame and hard for them to ride, they would bring them to Grant, and Grant would calm the horses down for them. One cadet remarked, it was as good as any circus to see Grant ride. And you can bet it was because Grant loved riding fast and he loved riding dangerously. There was one very spirited horse named York, and Grant was the only one who could ride him well. Another kid could ride him, but he couldn't ride him well. So when a cadet told him that York was going to kill him one day, Grant replied, well, you can only die once. Opinions of Grant at West Point. From Sherman, there was never a more unpromising student than Grant entering West Point. From other students, he was too friendly and good-natured to ever be a good general. He enjoyed friends who were marked with humor and mischief. In his studies, he was lazy and careless. He would read it over once or twice, but his perception was so good that he would make a fair recitation. He'd never attended any dances. He could have been at the top of his class if only he had applied himself. Grant was 21st over 39 in his graduating class in 1843. Now, a lot of authors say that he was just mediocre at West Point. I don't think that's really true. He was in the middle, and I don't know if you would call in the middle being mediocre, but when you think about 90 students had started in 1839 and he was 21, that puts him up there a little bit. His best subject was mathematics. He was 10th in the class in mathematics. Doesn't sound, not the top of the class, but when he wrote a mathematics professor asking him if he would have him as his assistant teacher at West Point when an opening occurred, he got a positive answer back. So that gave him some hope that he might be able to go back to West Point as a teacher and then maybe make a career at a college later on. His lowest subject was French. He hated French, and you can see that he's below the bottom of his class in French. There were 39 students in his class, and he was 44, so evidently some people who flunked out were better than Grant at French. As far as behavior is concerned, he was in just barely into the bottom half, so I think that makes him a pretty normal kid. Finally, graduation day came July 1st, 1843. This is a painting of what the graduation ceremonies look like out on the lawn of West Point. This is a bust of Winfield Scott. He was the guy who was head of the Army at the time, and he handed out diplomas the year that Grant graduated. He was 6'5" tall, very impressive looking, and wore every bit of uniform that he could possibly wear. He was also very taken with himself. This is an artist rendition of what it looked like when Winfield Scott gave Ulysses Grant his diploma. Winfield Scott was 6'5", Ulysses Grant was 5'8". Grant, referring to Winfield Scott later in his personal memoirs, said, "With his commanding figure, his quite colossal size, and showy uniform, I thought him the finest specimen of manhood my eyes had ever beheld, and the most to be envied." In his memoirs, Grant tells us of a presentiment he had when he was getting his diploma. And he said, "I could never resemble Winfield Scott in appearance, but I did have this presentiment that one day I would occupy his place on review." And even though he had no intention of remaining in the Army, he was just going to get that engineering degree and go as soon as he could. But he said that my experience in the horse trade 10 years before, where he got so much ridicule from the town, caused me to never communicate this presentiment to even my most intimate chum. At the end of the graduation exercises, the Corps of Cadets moved to the horse arena so they could show off their riding skills to the attendees. Grant was mounted on York, who was a huge, very spirited horse. After they had finished with all the other activities in the horse arena, the riding master, Sergeant Hirschberger, strode to the jumping bar, lifted it higher than his head, fixed it in place, and then, facing the crowd, barked, "Cadet Grant." James B. Fry, who later became a Union general, described a slender cadet dash from the ranks on a big sorrel, wheeling and galloping down toward the far end of the hall. He described Grant as he turned York, and then the two of them came thundering down toward the bar, faster and faster, then up in the air and over. In Fry's word, it seemed as if man and beast had been welded together. After the crowd saw this feat of horsemanship, all Sergeant Hirschberger could say was, "Well done, sir, class dismissed." According to early Grant biographer Albert D. Richardson, the height of Grant's jump was a record that stood at West Point for 25 years. By that time, Grant would be known for far more than horsemanship. This is James B. Fry, who wrote about witnessing the jump. He served as an assistant instructor of artillery from December 15, 1853. He became adjutant of the academy on August 1st, 1854, where he served until 1859. Leave after graduation. Home to Ohio. So after another 2 years without seeing his family, Grant graduates and then he gets a furlough, or more properly speaking, a leave of absence, for the class was now commissioned officers. The time was the end of September. Remember, to be a commissioned officer, you had to swear allegiance to the United States of America. Again, he said, I went to Ohio to spend my vacation with my old schoolmates, and again I found a fine saddle horse, whose name was Fashion, purchased for my special use beside a horse and buggy that I could drive. But he was not in the physical condition to enjoy himself because of a virus. This is a picture of Grant at West Point. It looks like it's his graduation picture. He is looking a little thin here. He had had something called Tyler's grip, which was a very bad case of the flu that probably they think maybe came from Russia over to the United States. He weighed 117 and was 5'1" when he entered the academy. Later, he gained 6 inches, but when he left, he still weighed 117 because of this virus. So he had lost a lot of weight. In the early 1840s, a severe strain of influenza spread throughout the United States. The disease was also known as lightning catarrh, was usually referred to as Tyler's grip. a response to the unpopular presidency of John Tyler. When he entered West Point, Grant was 5'1" and weighed 117 pounds, so he barely made it in. The minimum height was 5 feet. He had a BMI of 22.5. On leaving, he had grown 6 inches but was still 117 pounds. This time he had a BMI of only 18. He was very thin, and it still took months for him to fully recover after graduating. For 6 months before graduation, I had had a desperate cough, says Grant. Tyler's grip, it was called, and I was very much reduced, weighing but 117 pounds, just my weight at entrance, though I had grown 6 inches in stature in the meantime. There was consumption in my father's family, two of his brothers having died of that disease, which made my symptoms more alarming. The brother and sister next younger than myself died during the rebellion of the same disease, but I seemed the most promising subject to get it at the time. Grant wrote about the illness in his personal memoirs. For 6 months before graduation, I had had a desperate cough. Tyler's grip, it was called, and I was very much reduced, weighing but 117 pounds, just my weight at entrance, though I had grown 6 inches in stature in the meantime. There was consumption in my father's family, two of his brothers having died of that disease, which made my symptoms more alarming. The brother and sister next younger than myself died during the rebellion of the same disease, but I seemed the most promising subject for it of the three in 1843. He had ordered a uniform upon graduation, and it arrived a few weeks after he returned home. He wanted his old schoolmates, especially the girls, to see him in the uniform. So he decided to ride to Cincinnati to show it off. He assumed that everybody would be thinking of him just as he thought of General Scott. So in Cincinnati, a young urchin dressed in rags mocked him. "Soldier, will you work?" "No, sirree. I'd sell my shirt first. Oh, ain't I a big engine?" On his return home from Cincinnati, the innkeeper next door had on a pair of pantaloons just the blue of Ulysses's uniform, with a white stripe sewed down the side, and was marching back and forth in front of his business, much to the amusement of townspeople. Ulysses says, "I did not appreciate it so highly. The two humiliations gave me a distaste for military uniforms I never recovered from." First posting, Jefferson Barracks. After his leave was over, he had to make it from Cincinnati to St. Louis, where he had his first posting at Jefferson Barracks. He left Cincinnati by boat on the Ohio River. When he got to the Mississippi River, he took another boat and went up to St. Louis. Jefferson Barracks was named after Thomas Jefferson, who died a year before the barracks were established in 1827. So Union generals Ulysses S. Grant, William Sherman, Phil Sheridan, and Winfield Scott Hancock were all stationed there. Confederate generals Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, Albert Sidney Johnston, Joseph E. Johnson, and Braxton Bragg also served there, as did American President Zachary Taylor and Confederate President Jefferson Davis. All had been assigned to Jefferson Barracks over the years. When Grant got there, he was pleased to see his academy friends James Longstreet and Robert Hazlitt were there, assigned to the 4th. The 4th consisted of about 500 men. This is an early picture of Jefferson Barracks outside of St. Louis, Missouri. Stephen Kearny was commandant of Jefferson Barracks. Kearney required soldiers to be on time for drills, roll call, and meals, but allowed subordinates the freedom to go where they wanted without reporting their destination. Grant admired Kearney and his common sense method of handling discipline. Kearney, Nebraska, originally a fort established for the protection of settlers, was named after him. Robert C. Buchanan, known as a stickler, replaced him. Cadets thought him a gruff martinet. In his personal memoirs, Grant remembered his first days in the Army. It did seem to me in my early Army days that too many of the older officers, when they came to command post, made it a study to think what orders they could publish to annoy their subordinates and render them uncomfortable. I noticed, however, a few years later, when the Mexican War broke out, that most of this class of officers discovered they were possessed of disabilities which entirely incapacitated them from active service. They had the moral courage to proclaim it, too. Grant wanted to become a math teacher, so he wrote to West Point about a position from Professor Church when the next detail had to be made. He wanted to be Professor Church's assistant professor. He received a favorable reply. Accordingly, I laid out for myself a course of studies to be pursued in garrison with regularity, if not persistency. He was hoping to teach at the academy, then resign and get a position at a good college. Ulysses promised his roommate, Fred Dent, that he would visit his family. Dent's family lived 5 miles away from Jefferson Barracks. So Grant got a horse one day and went looking for the house. As he approached the Dent residence, he saw a 6-year-old girl in front of it. It was Emily Dent, who was age 6. She thought he was pretty as a doll. Grant went inside and met the parents and found them warm and welcoming, and soon was visiting once or twice a week. There were 2 brothers and 2 sisters at home. Colonel Dent, who had been a lawyer and a businessman, had moved to St. Louis 30 years ago. He purchased 925 acres of land, some slaves, and settled down to being a Southern aristocrat. The farm had 18 slaves, including Mary Robinson. 18-year-old Julia was away with friends. Julia was the oldest and the plainest, but loaded with a great personality and personal warmth. After she arrived, Grant's visits increased to every day. This is the current map, but you can still see where Ulysses had to ride to visit the Dent home. Jefferson Barracks was over by the Mississippi River, and then he would ride along the Gravois River. There was a path along there till he got to the Dent home, which is today called the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Grant describes meeting Julia in his personal memoirs. There was still an older daughter of 17 who had been spending several years at boarding school in St. Louis, but who, though through with school, had not yet returned home. She was spending the winter in the city with connections, the family of Colonel John O'Fallon, well known in St. Louis. In February, she returned to her country home. Grant continues, after that, I do not know, but my visits became more frequent. They certainly did become more enjoyable. We would often take walks or go on horseback to visit the neighbors until I became quite well acquainted in that vicinity. Sometimes one of the brothers would accompany us, sometimes one of the younger sisters. This is one of the youngest pictures we have of Grant. In it, he was about 28 years old, so he was older than he would have been at the time that he was courting Julia. This is a photo of the young Julia Grant. obviously not the most beautiful of the sisters. She was the oldest, and she had this warm, outgoing, bubbly, demonstrative personality. And that's what sold her to Grant. He wanted someone who was pretty much opposite of what his mother was. Here's a couple of courting stories from their days of dating. One night they went to a Methodist revival with a group of friends, and evidently back then that was the closest thing you could come to a date. A storm came up and the girls were in need of shelter. Grant took charge and had his tall friend Hazlitt act as a tent pole. He threw the tarp from the wagon over him, and the girls crouched at his feet, mostly dry, while the other young men got soaked. Okay, another time, Julia and Ulysses were out riding when they came across an old slave who had got his foot cut with an axe. Grant tore the man's vest apart to make a tourniquet. The man was more upset about the loss of his vest. Grant was back the next day with an army vest for the man and an army surgeon to tend to him. About music, they were totally opposites. Julia loved music. She could sing, she could play the piano, and she loved to dance. Ulysses was tone deaf. He could not tell one song from the other, and he would not dance. We don't know if he wouldn't dance because he was tone deaf or because his mother thought that maybe dancing was a sin, but he never danced. Grant would accompany Julia to a lot of dances, but he would stand around and watch the dancing, never participating. As he once said, I only know two tunes. One is Yankee Doodle and the other isn't. Okay, this is Robert Buchanan. He took the place of Stephen Kearny at Jefferson Barracks. Now, Grant really liked Kearny because he thought he had a reasonable expectations for the soldiers. If he needed you there, he wanted you there. If you needed to be there for parade or something like that, you should be there and be on time. But if he didn't need you there, you were welcome to go and do your social events, and you didn't have to write down where you were going. So Robert Buchanan was a little bit different. He was, some people say, a martinet as far as discipline was concerned. So while courting Julia, Grant was often late for dinner at the barracks. Late officers were fined a bottle of wine. One incident a fellow soldier remembered. So Buchanan said, Grant, you're late as usual, another bottle of wine, sir. Quietly, Grant rose and with an effort at pleasantry said, Mr. President, I've been fined 3 bottles of wine within the last 10 days, and if I'm to be fined again, I shall be obliged to repudiate. Hotly, Buchanan flared back, Grant, young people should be seen and not heard. Some of the officers recalling the incident in later years said that neither Buchanan nor Grant ever forgot it. You'll need to remember this when we get to California with Grant. It might have some effect on what happened to him there. Okay, while he was courting Julia, Grant had to deal with her parents. Grant had many discussions with Julia's father. Dent was as bombastic in his pro-slavery views as Grant's father was with his abolitionist views. Colonel Dent liked Grant, but he did not have a good opinion of any soldier marrying his eldest daughter, Julia. He thought the life would be too hard for his delicate daughter, and soldiers were not paid well enough. According to an interview with her former house slave, Mary Robinson, Old Man Dent was opposed to him when he found he was courting his daughter and did everything he could to prevent the match. But Mrs. Dent took a great fancy to him and his venture. Mrs. Dent used to say to me, I like that young man. There is something noble in him. His air and the expression of his face convince me that he has a noble heart and that he will be a great man someday. After he had been at Jefferson Barracks for about a year, Grant applied for and got a leave to go visit his parents in Bethel, Ohio. But before leaving, he asked Julia to wear his class ring. If you recall, this was the ring that the kids in the club TIO 12N1 had made. They all had the same one, and it was supposed to be for their future bride. Well, she had never thought of him as a lover. She just thought of him as a fun friend that, she would go horseback riding with and take walks with. So she declined, saying that her mother wouldn't allow it. And then she also felt like she was only 17 and she really wasn't ready for marriage. Just about right after he got on the boat, the 4th Infantry was ordered to Natchitoches, Louisiana. So the regiment was leaving. He didn't know about it, and so he went on to Ohio, and when he got there, he found a letter from a friend saying, "Go ahead and enjoy your vacation. Don't open anything up from the Army. I will take all your stuff to Louisiana, and we'll catch up there. So, and just go ahead and take your leave." So he did that. One of the things that his friend was going to move for him was his diary. He had kept a diary in West Point and at Jefferson Barracks, and it was full of things that young men might write about: crushes on girls, fights with other men, things like that. So when he got to Natchitoches, it never showed up. And so throughout his life, he always thought, if somebody has that and it should show up now, it would get all over the newspapers and just make me look like a fool. There would be much heartburning if that ever happened. Julia had found out that the regiment was leaving too. When she found that out, it caused her to change her mind, and suddenly she did want to marry Grant. She did want to get engaged. So she went riding to Jefferson Barracks looking for him, but he had already left to visit his parents. When he returned to St. Louis from Bethel, he realized that there was something the matter with me, and he asked for more leave to settle a personal problem. So he was granted the leave, and he headed immediately for the Dent's house. At that time, they were having a lot of rain, and the usual little quiet creek that went in front of their house, called the Gravois Creek, was a raging torrent. So he just decided he had to get across and see Julia. So he dove his horse into the water. It got carried downstream, and he finally made it across, but he was soaking wet. So he went and found one of her brothers and asked for a change of clothing, which he got, but it was much, much bigger than he was. So he arrived at the house, and everybody laughed at him, but he had made it in. The family had been invited to a wedding, so they asked Grant to come along with them. He arranged for her brother to ride his horse while he drove Julia in the buggy. They had to cross a bridge over a raging creek, and this terrified Julia. So she told him, "Now, if anything happens, remember, I shall cling to you no matter what you say to the contrary." He said, "All right," and drove across the creek. When they got to the other side, he used her threat of clinging to him tightly as a theme and proposed marriage to her. This time, she accepted. This is the current day picture of where the house is, the Dent house is. You can see now there's housing developments all around it. But the Gravois Creek is still there, so you can see where Ulysses had to go when he had to cross it, as it was a raging stream. Now, when they got back from the wedding, Julia and Ulysses had a talk, and she said that he could not tell anyone that they were engaged. It had to be a secret. As it was a secret engagement, he would not be able to ask her father for permission to marry her. To get to Natchitoches, Louisiana, Grant had to go down the Mississippi River until he got to the junction of the Red River and the Mississippi. Then he had to take another boat up to Natchitoches and on to Camp Salubrity. At that point, he joined what was being called the Army of Observation. They were looking into Texas to see what Mexico was going to do about Texas declaring its independence and then coming as a state into the United States. We will leave Ulysses in Louisiana this time in the Army of Observation, and next time we will begin Grant in the Mexican War.